This lecture forms the beginning of the background that you're going to need to get a grip on some of the texts and the issues. It's just a place to start. You don't have to know all this stuff. As I said before, you don't have to know any of this. We're going to get through it together. So we'll just start here. I'm going to go through these 5 different, basically pieces of the history. Okay, so you'll see them here, and I'm going to start first with a name. The name, what's going on here? One of the things we can say about the country Vietnam is that the name of the country is actually Vietnam, 2 words where there are these crucial diacritical marks over the E, one over the E and under the E. Vietnamese, when it's written, is enormously complex. It requires these diacritical marks to make sense of what the words actually mean. So if you just, if you showed somebody Vietnamese without the diacritical marks, they would not know what the intention of the author was, basically, unless the words are very plain. So you have to have them. The first thing the Americans did when they arrived in Vietnam was to bring the 2 words together, make it Vietnam, which increasingly is how it was spelled, and get rid of the diacritical marks. So it's one of these interesting things where linguistically we can see that, as the country was occupied and fought over, one of the first things that happened was that its identity, its linguistic identity, was erased. The country, the country's background was erased. The context here I'm going to talk about are, when I talk about this, try to give you a little sense of this, is I'm going to reduce literally hundreds of thousands of events to a very, very few key things that I think will be useful and are memorable, basically. And so these 3 things I'm going to talk about are the American geopolitical position in the post-World War II world. So what did the world look like from the American point of view, or from the get a bit more light on the subject here. What do things look like in 1946? And then the legacy of colonialism in Vietnam, which is the second thing, and the third thing, which is the domino theory. So to take up this first thing, which is the post-war world, this map may help a little bit to clarify what I mean. Now, let me take issue right away with this person's dates. I just picked this. I was looking through maps and I'm like, yeah, this will do. I don't agree with these dates. My dates would be 1946 to 1989. And it's always a matter of where you mark things, and different historians mark things differently, and so on. So this is a useful map. Visually, it's not very useful in terms of dates, but that's fine. So if it's 1946, and this is to some extent a map of the world in 1946, you can see that the United States and its allies from World War II, including Australia, Australia and New Zealand down on the lower right, and in the center of the map, most of Europe, including the Scandinavian countries, and the UK, of course, Turkey, which is modernizing, and Japan. You'll see over on the right again, this is one of these very surprising things where Japan and Germany become staunch allies of the United States and the Western democracies in the immediate war environment. These form the free market democracies, for want of a better word, and they are, in general, pose themselves against the communist countries. And so we'll see the Soviet Union. Why is it called the Soviet Union? The United Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is the USSR. because it includes, if you look down at West Germany and East Germany, well, West Germany is not communist, but East Germany is, and so are the other countries that are taken up, that are sort of absorbed into, by force, into the Soviet Union. So Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and so on. And these will, Ukraine, and these will produce what is called a buffer zone, sometimes around the Soviet Union. The idea is to protect the Soviet Union from attack, forcing the West to, if the West wanted to attack the Soviet Union overland through Europe, it would have to do so by going through its ex-allies during World War II, and otherwise friendly nations. So that's the idea there. This three world order that this map talks about then is marked by the third world, and the third world, this is how we get the three worlds, which is the global, now what we call the global south, which is sometimes called developing nations. Well, they're not really developing, they've developed, but they're industrially developing, that's the point. And okay, so what we have, so then these are the South America, Africa, almost the entire of the middle, all the entirety of the Middle East, South Asia, and all the little tiny countries that are beneath China. And you'll see there, if you look just at the bottom of China, you'll see there's a little arrow to North Vietnam, which is pink because it's a communist country, and South Vietnam, which is green because it is not, and then all of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Kalimantan, Borneo, Sumatra, and so on. Okay. And you'll see that South Korea is green and is considered to be part of the third world. This is before the war in the Koreas. And actually this map would antedate, it comes after the Civil War in Korea, which brings about the divided Korea, which we still have. Okay. These three groups then make the first world, which is considered, which calls itself the first world because it wants to be the first world, which is an industrialized market economy, to a greater or lesser extent industrialized. The Soviet Union, which is the second world, the third world, which is the developing, non-industrialized South, basically. Okay. What begins then in 1946 is a struggle between the two major groups for the third group, so that the parts of the map that are colored blue basically go to war with the parts of the map that are colored red, to put it very bluntly, for the parts of the map that are colored green. In other words, let's say that I'm America and I want to develop resources in Chile, which has mines. I want to develop mining and say oil exploration and things like that in Chile. And I also want to have a foothold in South America. You can see Chile down there, which runs this very long country, runs all the way down the western side of South America. Okay, well, what I might do as an American is approach, because I don't want to invade Chile, because that would be unfriendly. I approach business people in Chile and I say, and the government, and I say, hey, I've got a deal for you. Open this up to oil exploration and mining interests in the United States, and we'll cut you a good deal, and so on. And while I'm doing that, the Soviet Union is doing the same thing. What that means is that if we're going to get into a tussle over it, I will begin arming friends of the United States, and the Soviet Union begins arming friends of the Soviet Union in Chile. And at a certain point, I may feel that it's time for us to go to war over the future of Chile. Okay. That is what we call a proxy war, because it's really the United States and the Soviet Union that are fighting, but they're fighting by proxy in Chile, right? So it's a proxy war. So these proxy wars begin to break out across the globe, basically, between 1946 and 1989. Why am I ending things in 1989? Because the Soviet Union, as we knew it up until that point, collapsed economically and politically. It was making moves towards becoming more democratic under Premier Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, and then Boris Yeltsin. And there was a lot of support for that, and there was interest in the Soviet Union and so on. By 1989, those forces they triumphed, and the system collapsed as it had been running. And countries that had been kept under the sort of yoke of the Soviet Union, so Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, were released, including East Germany, and East and West Germany were reunified. Because there's the Berlin Wall, and there was this division of Germany into two. Okay. In 1989, that all ends. The Berlin Wall comes down, and basically people in the West said, "You see, we were right. Democracy is a better system. Free markets rule, etc." And it was the end of that particular Cold War, which had been ongoing between 1946 and 1989. The Cold War then, it can be defined as a series of wars that were fought both economically, politically, ideologically, between the United States and the Soviet Union, and by proxy in other parts of the world. Why am I harping on this proxy thing? Because Vietnam is one of these proxies, right? So Cold Wars don't become hot wars. That's the idea. The idea is to prevent the war from breaking into a World War III and having a nuclear exchange, which would pretty much end life on the planet, and so on. There are considered to be two parts to the Cold War. Although people don't usually talk about the first Cold War, they often do talk about the second Cold War. It's one of these bizarre things. The first Cold War really goes up to about 1976, when the Vietnam War has been over for a year, and Jimmy Carter enters the presidency, the White House, and begins to look for ways to make peace. Although Nixon has already gone to China and has opened the doors to trade with China, which is a very important and crucial thing to have happen. But Carter is going to try to, and will successfully, engineer a peace between Egypt and Israel, which was a huge, massive stroke of diplomacy. And he will overall be a peace president. He is not interested in having any more wars. He's a bright guy. He's a nuclear engineer. He's a PhD in nuclear science, he was a Navy guy during the war, not interested in making war. And he spends really the rest of his life thoroughly engaged in political acts for good. I mean, he's now in his 90s, he's got brain cancer. He's still working for Habitat for Humanities. I mean, it's amazing, right? I mean, just an amazing guy. I think he's in his 90s. He's or his late 80s. He's an older guy. So in that period of 4 years, basically between 1975, as soon as Nixon leaves the presidency in 74, 72. Sorry, 74, I'm right, yeah. And was forced out because he was a crook. He was, we get this calming where the United States begins to make all kinds of diplomatic overtures to the rest of the world and says, we would like to have peace. And the world's like, yeah, that sounds good. So fine. In 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected president. He will be president for 2 terms. And this begins this, what is called the Second Cold War, or the deepening of the Cold War, where things chill, not in a good way. This is not Netflix and chill, this is cold chill. And Reagan begins the rhetorical fighting basically with Russia again. He calls Russia the evil empire. He says, he jokes about dropping bombs on Russia, and so on. There is during this time an arms race, which is both nuclear and non-nuclear, between, again, for want of a better way of putting it, the blue countries and the red countries. In the course of the post-war world, where we are left with three superpowers, really, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, they begin to look at making friends, like, let's make friends. You know, where can we make friends across the world? Now, when we come to the United States, this is a map of the US military presence, as you see abroad, where every country that is pink has a military, standing military base in it. So obviously we're not including the United States there, which is a big gray area. Yeah. So there's a scramble for territory, because the United States at this point now, as of this map, has forces present in 156 of 196 countries in the world. So there are, give or take, because it's often changing, the little tiny countries are often appearing and sort of disappearing depending on their luck and how things are going globally. So 196 countries, 156 of these have agreed to take basically standing militaries or military bases by the United States. So if you want to hit somewhere with your bombers or something like that, you can pretty much get to anywhere in the planet relatively quickly. Let me keep that relatively. So the scramble then becomes for territory. And these are what I'm talking about as it begins proxy wars, or what are sometimes called brush fire wars, because they're fought in the brush. You know, they're not fought on the open. They're fought in countries where there really, literally is heavy jungle. So you're fighting in the brush, you're fighting in the bush, you're fighting in the jungle. Okay. This is actually the first part of this contextual background. So let me stop here